War of the Worlds, The Resurrection. A novel by J. M. Dillard. Chapter 21. The next several hours spent hiding and shivering in the cold, dark forest were as nightmarish as anything Harrison had ever experienced. He and Iron Horse kept moving, pausing at times to hold perfectly still as the aliens passed by with soft, slithering rustles, and the clumsier sound of human yet inhuman footfalls crashing through the underbrush. Without Iron Horse, he would not have made it. In his near delirium, unable to distinguish alien forms from the ominous black shapes of the bushes. The colonel remained calmly watchful, and somehow managed to keep Harrison moving long after he wanted to give up. By dawn, their trackers had given up and passed out of the forest, and Harrison realized Suzanne, too, was nowhere to be found in the woods. Iron Horse had circled back and led them to the place where they'd left her, but there was no sign of her. Discouraged, they rested, Iron Horse crouching on the ground, but keeping one eye open. Harrison sitting on the rock where Suzanne had sat. He was exhausted beyond reason from fear and chill and exertion, and his back ached where Iron Horse had struck him the night before. One scene played over and over like a B-grade melodrama in his mind. Mrs. Pennyworth with one arm around a fair-haired girl, and Harrison, the heavy, saying, "I'm sorry, Debbie, but your mother..." He couldn't find the words, but it didn't matter. Debbie understood all too well.
"You killed her! You killed my mother!"
the girl screamed, clawing at him, while Mrs. Pennyworth did her best to hold Debbie back. But the girl broke free and grabbed hold of him. Someone shook his shoulder. Harrison opened his eyes to see Iron Horse standing over him. Amazingly, the colonel looked no worse for wear. "They're still gone," Iron Horse said. "I'm going down to the house and check for survivors." "Suzanne," Harrison began and broke off, confused, not knowing exactly what it was he meant to say about her. He rubbed his face. Iron Horse removed his hand from Harrison's shoulder and glanced down into the valley. "It's possible she decided to go down there," he said, but Harrison heard the doubt in his tone. "He knows she's dead. He just wants to see if any of his men are still alive." Harrison got shakily to his feet. "I'll go with you." Iron Horse stood up, raising a coal-black brow. "No offense, Blackwood, but you don't look up to..." "I'm going with you," Harrison repeated firmly, shaking his arms and legs to get the stiffness out. "Then we had better do it fast before they figure out where we are and head back this way." Harrison nodded and took a few staggering steps. If Suzanne wasn't down there, at least he'd know for sure that the aliens had her, and that she was dead, or worse. He limped down the hill behind Iron Horse, every step aggravating the pain in his back. Down in the valley, the air was still faintly acrid. The house and barn still smoldered. "Here." Iron Horse paused to remove the rifle that hung on a strap around his back, and offered it to Harrison. "I'll use this." He patted the pistol in his side holster. Harrison shook his head. "No thanks." He disapproved, in theory anyway, of the damn things, and right now he didn't feel he deserved to protect himself. Iron Horse pushed it at him. "Don't be stupid. There might still be some of them down here." "No," Harrison said more firmly, and walked ahead of him. Iron Horse shrugged and grasped the rifle in both hands, following. The grass gave way to dirt near the barn. The colonel apparently saw something. He moved quickly to the entrance and crouched down in the sand. "What is it?" Harrison followed as quickly as he could. "It's Gordy," Iron Horse whispered, then said aloud, "Sergeant Reynolds. His body was here. Now it's gone." What? Harrison blinked down at the tangled mass of cable by Iron Horse, then peered uneasily into the barn. All was quiet darkness. Iron Horse picked up the alien weapon and studied it, then dropped it to one side. There was a deep red congealed spot on the ground. Still sitting on his heels, the colonel reached with one hand, not quite brushing his fingers over the spot where Reynolds had fallen. "Gordy," he said without looking at Harrison. "Damn them." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Damn them to hell." Harrison stood back quietly, feeling a tug of sympathy for the man. Beneath the tough guy exterior, there was a real human being. And as horrible as it was for Harrison to lose Suzanne, how much worse must the loss of so many men be for the colonel? Iron Horse crouched silently with his back to Harrison for a while, then raised his head and said, "Over there, look at that." He pointed to two blackish, evil-looking masses near the barn entrance. "One of those was the man Reynolds shot, and one of those was the ATV rider who tried to waste me." He looked questioningly at Harrison. "What the hell is this?" "I don't know," Harrison answered honestly. "Unbelievable." Iron Horse shook his head, then rose. "I'll check out the barn. Think you're up for the house?" "Sure." Harrison wasn't really, but he left the colonel where he was and walked over to the old farmhouse. The front door had been kicked off its hinges and lay in the middle of the doorway, half in, half out. Harrison stepped over it gingerly. In the front room the walls were charred, plaster lay scattered on the floor, and the wooden ceiling beams hung down in long, thin shreds. A faint trace of gas remained, stinging his eyes and making them tear. He circled around the first floor through the kitchen and dining room until he arrived back at the entrance near the staircase. "Suzanne?" he called out timidly. There were signs of struggle everywhere, but amazingly enough, no bodies. Harrison climbed the rickety stairs with some trepidation. In one of the second-floor bedrooms, he found purplish stains spattered across a wall and realized it must be alien blood. But excitement faded quickly to disappointment. There was no way to get a sample. All of his instruments were smashed, useless, up on the hillside. "Suzanne?" he called again, this time louder as desperation began to take hold of him. There was no denying it. She really was gone. He stumbled down the stairs, through the front doorway, and out into the brightening daylight. He stood on the front porch and leaned heavily against one of the remaining posts. Let the damn house collapse on him. He didn't care. He remembered his words to her and shuddered. "Dr. McCullough, if you get yourself killed, I will never forgive you." Fat lot of good that had done. He thought about the things he had forced himself to ignore while she was still alive, like how beautiful she was. As lovely as Charlotte. No. Damn it, even prettier, because unlike Char, Suzanne seemed totally unaware of her good looks. Okay, so maybe she'd been an uptight person, but she had her priorities straight. Once she was convinced the alien threat was real, she'd been a trooper, hadn't complained once about the trips, about the danger, had even insisted on coming when she knew the risk involved. And in some crazy way, he felt he had been able to get over Charlotte so easily because he had hoped that somehow Suzanne and he... He didn't even let himself finish the thought. Wouldn't have worked anyway. No two people were less alike. He rested his forehead against the post, ignoring the ominous creak, and didn't look up when Iron Horse walked up and said, "Nothing. You?" Harrison shook his head. "Damn it," he whispered, swallowing hard to keep back tears. He wouldn't cry here, now, especially not in front of the poker-faced colonel. I shouldn't have let her talk me into bringing her along. To his surprise, Iron Horse's tone was sympathetic. It wasn't your fault, Blackwood. Then whose was it? Harrison jerked his head up angrily. All right, so she was the most uptight person I've ever met. But at least she believed me. Where else am I going to find someone like her? A violent sneeze coming from underneath the porch caused the worn wooden planks under Harrison's feet to shudder. He dashed off the porch and stood next to Iron Horse, who raised his rifle as the grate under the porch began to move, then fell forward onto the grass. Suzanne, her face smudged and dirty, peered out. "It's me! For God's sake, don't shoot!" Iron Horse grinned and lowered the gun. He and Harrison knelt down as Suzanne struggled from the crawl space on her stomach. They both helped her to her feet. She was filthy, her jacket and khakis covered with dirt and cobwebs, but to Harrison she looked absolutely gorgeous. He was grinning so hard his cheeks hurt. Impulsively, he grabbed her and squeezed her tightly, not giving a damn anymore what the colonel thought. She responded gratefully, hugging back with enthusiasm at first, but then something caused her to stiffen in his embrace. She wormed free. "I'll have you know that I am not uptight," she said indignantly, brushing at the spiderwebs in her straight, dark brown hair. "I am a professional." He laughed at the realization she had been honestly insulted by his remark. Still giddy with relief, he said, "A professional who doesn't know how to take orders. You were supposed to stay hidden back in the forest, remember? I spent one hell of a night looking for you." She bristled at that. "You neglected to tell me that those things, aliens, were going to be crawling all over. By the time I slipped away and worked my way down here, you and the colonel were doing your off-road routine." She pointed at the crawl space. "This seemed like a good place to wait things out. You think you spent a hell of a night. I was down there trying to negotiate with the rats and the snakes. And it was freezing last night. I'm still shivering." She rubbed her arms in an effort to warm herself, and craned her neck to peer anxiously around. "The aliens. Where are they?" "Hard to know," Iron Horse replied, stooping to retrieve one of the makeshift weapons from the ground. "From their tracks, I'd say they split up in a dozen directions." He held the weapon up, letting it dangle. "This is some weird stuff we're dealing with here. A bola made from what looks like baling wire and old gears. I saw a stripped-down old tractor behind the barn." He looked over at Harrison. "The truck was parked in the barn, all right. There are tire tracks in there that came from an 18-wheeler, along with more empty barrels. I counted 36. Truck's gone now, and they must have taken the unopened barrels with them." Harrison closed his eyes and turned away, sickened. He had hoped to stop them while there were only a handful free, before they'd had a chance to release any of the others. "If they made these, they must be pretty intelligent," Iron Horse continued. "But the weirdest thing about all this are the terrorists who don't act like terrorists, who don't die like terrorists. At first, I thought that maybe there were human beings behind all this. Then I thought maybe some strange cooperation between humans and aliens, but now..." Harrison turned back to look at him. "Whatever they were, Colonel, they weren't human." "Agreed." Iron Horse shook his head, as if unable to believe what he had seen. "If I tell my superiors, they'll give me a Section 8 so fast my head would spin. But I know what I saw. A body dissolved after I shot it, the same way it happened with the guy Reynolds shot just before he was killed." "I saw it too," Harrison told him grimly. "So did I." Suzanne nodded thoughtfully, once again in scientist mode. "I've been thinking about that. Did you notice how clumsily they moved? Almost as if..." She faltered, then continued. "As if they weren't used to using their own bodies." She glanced at Iron Horse. "Maybe you'll think I qualify for a Section 8 after this, but it seemed to me that the aliens were controlling those bodies, the way one would a puppet, either mentally or, more likely, from within." Harrison gaped at her, astounded. You mean an alien inside a human body? Come on, Suzanne, we both know that's impossible. Is it? She responded coolly, arching a delicate brow at him. Where's your much-touted imagination, Dr. Blackwood? Ironhorse seemed interested. Shut up and listen, he told Harrison. She's got a point. When that guy dissolved, it seemed he had something black inside, something that didn't belong. Hell, you've got the remains of 3 of them around here. All you need to do is take a look. He turned to Suzanne. But they dissolved, just like something out of a grade B horror flick. She nodded. This is all pure conjecture, but maybe, in order to exit the human body, the alien secretes a strong acid. It would destroy the host, of course. And the alien, too, if it was hurt or couldn't make it out in time, Ironhorse finished, stroking his chin. Harrison frowned. Like you say, Suzanne, it's all pure conjecture, but at least we've got the concrete proof Uncle General Wilson wanted. If we can just figure out a way to transport some of those bodies with us. Ironhorse removed his jacket. You can use this, he said as Suzanne grimaced and Harrison looked uncertain. The colonel shrugged. But whatever we do, let's do it fast before they come back. Within a matter of hours, they were face to face with General Wilson in a borrowed office at Vandenberg Air Force Base. Wilson stood contemplating the sunny fall morning beyond the window, one loosely clenched hand resting against the small of his back, the other holding the bowl of his pipe. Seated behind him were his niece and Harrison, who slumped warily in the straight-back wooden chair and tried to ignore his throbbing back, aggravated by the hours spent sitting in the helicopter and then waiting to see Wilson. Suzanne looked far better than Harrison felt. She sat upright in the chair, hands folded in her lap, and her damn the torpedoes expression combined with the determined tilt of her chin gave Harrison comfort. Clearly, she and the general were made of the same stern stuff. During the past few days, Harrison reflected, she'd given more like 300% than 150. He shot her an encouraging look. She saw, but was too focused on what Wilson was saying to acknowledge. Her uncle was still staring out the window. What you're telling me, then, he said in response to Suzanne's extended monologue, is that you failed to get the sort of hard evidence I asked for. Harrison and Suzanne gasped simultaneously, but she got the first word in. Failed to get proof? Her voice was shrill, indignant. For God's sake, I just showed you my figures on the radiation levels at Jericho Valley. Theory, Wilson countered without looking at her. What about the partially dissolved body we recovered? Harrison retorted, impatient that Wilson seemed to be playing some sort of game with them. How much more concrete can we get? Wilson sighed. There wasn't much left, hardly identifiable. I'll take your word that it's what you say it is, but frankly, anyone could dissolve tissues with acid and claim their alien remains. Harrison watched with interest as a bright red flush spread across Suzanne's cheeks and the bridge of her nose. Her brows flew together. Surely you're not suggesting that we tampered? I'm not suggesting any such thing, Suzanne. He turned his head to regard her from the corner of his eye. I'm telling you the kinds of things my superiors will say to me. Harrison came to their defense. 3 eyewitnesses, General, he said emphatically, and one of them an Army colonel. What more do you need? Lieutenant Colonel, actually, Wilson corrected him, turning his short, stocky body toward them. And as yet, he hasn't officially backed your story. That son of a... Harrison muttered darkly. Wilson ignored him and walked over to the small government-issued desk to empty the contents of his pipe into a glass ashtray, then refill it with fresh tobacco. So, Suzanne sat, a coiled spring, hands clutching the armrests, knees and ankles together, posture unnaturally stiff.
Our word, mine and Harrison's, counts for nothing then.
Wilson looked up from the ashtray and gestured apologetically with his pipe. I didn't say that, Suzanne, but it is hearsay. Hearsay? Harrison blurted. Exhaustion magnified his frustration, and he began to rise from his chair until Suzanne reached out with a restraining arm. He sank back with a sickening sensation of defeat. How can you call it that? When I tell my superiors, that's what they will call it.
A whole squadron of soldiers were killed,
Suzanne exclaimed. Missing, Wilson said, spreading his plump hands. AWOL. No bodies recovered. Harrison lowered his head into his hands. He saw it all clearly now. Wilson wasn't going to help then, and had never intended to help them. The general had come all this way only to find out about his missing squadron, and didn't believe them for a minute, had permitted these meetings only to placate Suzanne. He understood now how Clayton had felt during his nervous breakdown. Dear God, I've failed. Failed Clayton, Mom, Dad, everyone. And after all that I've done, it's going to all happen again. He felt Suzanne's hand on his arm and forced himself to look up. Why don't you believe me when I tell you what I saw?
What we all saw.
Suzanne jumped to her feet, fists clenched.
Damn it all, Uncle Hank. Talk to your colonel. If he won't tell you that he saw his men killed, then bring him here and let me have a word with him.
Calm down, Suzanne, and have a seat, Wilson answered firmly, gesturing for her to sit. He waited until she reluctantly did so, then sat behind the desk. Actually, I talked to the colonel at length very early this morning. He hasn't made an official report of what happened, and he isn't going to. At Harrison's angry expression, he hastened to add, at least not an unclassified one. But he did admit that something incredible took place last night. What did he tell you? Harrison demanded bitterly. That the Russians have some super-secret device that made us all hallucinate? Hardly. Wilson paused to relight his pipe and drew on it, his sharp blue eyes scrutinizing them from behind a fresh haze of smoke. I didn't mean to upset either of you. I'm trying to explain why, considering the uncertain nature of what we're dealing with, it's vital that this whole affair be kept top secret. He rested his elbows on the desk and leaned forward. When Delta Squad is defeated, captured, the Army sits up and takes notice. His tone was confidential. So do I, and my superiors. Very important superiors. Suzanne knows who I mean. Harrison glanced first at Wilson, then at Suzanne, scarcely daring to believe what he just heard. But he saw hope light up Suzanne's pale, drawn face. The president? So he'd been right the first time. The general had just been toying with them. Wilson sat back, obviously pleased with the effect his words had. These same people are very eager to keep this matter hush-hush. Harrison sat forward with a sudden surge of energy. Hold it right there, General. Keeping this quiet won't make it go away. I remember what happened to Clayton Forrester 35 years ago when the Army decided to hush things up. To his utter amazement, Wilson nodded sympathetically. I understand. What happened to your adoptive father was an unfortunate mistake, Dr. Blackwood. For all of us. I think we've come far enough along to not make the same mistake twice. He corrected himself. My superiors would rather this didn't become a political issue. They want it kept quiet, but that doesn't mean they want it ignored. I've been asked to offer you a job. Harrison gaped at him, unable to believe what he had just heard. Wilson's expression was somber. "Find the aliens, Dr. Blackwood. Stop them before they do more harm." A surge of relief washed over Harrison, a sensation so sweet tears stung the back of his eyes. He closed them and wished Clayton were sitting there with them. "Pinch me," he whispered, looking over at Suzanne. "I'm dreaming." This time they reached for each other at the same time, their laughter sounding suspiciously close to sobs. Suzanne gave him an awkward squeeze, then withdrew into her chair again. She shook her head, smiling warmly.
"You're not dreaming,"
she said huskily.
"I told you Uncle Hank would come through."
She gazed affectionately at her uncle. Harrison's exhilaration faded as a sudden suspicion took hold of him. "Wait a minute," he said to Wilson. "I want a guarantee I can do things my way. No red tape." "Guaranteed," Wilson nodded. "Your own people, your own methods, whatever you want." "Now I am dreaming." "Naturally," Wilson continued, "we'll have to establish certain security procedures." Harrison's grin faded as he became defensive again. "What kinds of procedures?" Wilson's gaze was innocent. "To protect you and your colleagues, and to protect the secrecy of the project. Nothing you wouldn't do yourself, I assure you." Damn it, Harrison thought. I knew there had to be a catch. But at this point, he knew he had already gotten more than he'd hoped for. No point in alienating Wilson while he was feeling generous. Wilson went on. "Aside from that, you have a blank check." Harrison and Suzanne looked at each other with wide eyes.
"How big a check?"
Suzanne asked coyly. Wilson shrugged cavalierly, doing his best not to smile as he spoke, but surrendering at last. "I think the Federal Reserve can cover any check you choose to write." He hesitated. "Of course, you'll need a co-signer." He reached across the desk for the intercom, pressed down a button, and said, "We're ready now." "Oh, Lord," Harrison muttered, understanding everything. The door opened, and Lieutenant Colonel Paul Ironhorse entered, wearing a freshly laundered uniform and the barest trace of that aggravatingly smug sneer. Harrison put his head in his hands and groaned. Suzanne emitted a gentle sigh. "Well," Wilson said brightly, rising, "I believe you all know one another?"
"Hello?"
The connection was full of static, and Forrester's voice sounded weak and breathless. "Clayton?" Harrison asked excitedly. "Clayton, I'm calling from Vandenberg Air Force Base. They believe us. They're actually going to help us." Silence for a few seconds, and then Clayton breathed.
Thank God, Harrison, I knew you'd do it."
Harrison laughed, feeling exhilarated and giddy. "Suzanne and Norton did, too. Listen, they're going to take us somewhere safe, and I've told them I want you to come, too. Someone from General Wilson's office will be contacting you."
"You don't need me, Harrison,"
Clayton said. But Harrison could tell from his voice that Forrester was pleased.
"I'd just be in the way."
"Bag the old in-the-way excuse, Clayton. I don't have time for arguments. We're leaving tonight."
"Tonight? That's a bit soon, don't you think?"
"The sooner the better," Harrison stated emphatically. Forrester hesitated.
"I'm an old man, Harrison. I can't be rushed. I'll come, but there are some archived papers at the Institute."
"Good Lord, more files?"
"More files,"
Clayton stated firmly.
"Perhaps not as vital as the ones I've given you, but we can use every scrap of information we can get our hands on. I'll get Jacoby to help me. Just give me a day or two."
"Tell it to Wilson's office when they call, but they aren't going to like it."
"That's their problem. And Harrison?"
"Yes, Clayton?"
"I love you, son."